This podcast is brought to you by sarahraven.com, which is home to everything you need for a truly beautiful and productive garden. You'll also find great and essential gardening kit and stylish, lovely things to have in your house to bring the outside indoors, all inspired by the garden and the house being tied together. There's also plenty of garden inspiration, how-to videos and specialist growing guides, so head over to sarahraven.com today to discover even more. Welcome to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven, and various guests. But as part of the series I'm doing on the colour garden, the kaleidoscope garden, I'm on my own for the next quite a few actually, because I'm explaining my whole colour theory that has formed the basis of the garden at Perch Hill for 32 years, but also even predating that, kind of what I did as a florist and how I put colours together. And it's a sort of foundation stone of everything I do, really, and feels absolutely kind of pivotal to the garden here, but also to the house, to everything. I already did one episode introducing the different palettes and the colours that went within them. And so you can find that on the first episode of this. And so 4 palettes, each with 6 colours within them, so 24 colours. And in this episode, I'm going to move on and I'm going to explain a little bit more detail about things like how my colour theory relates to colour charts, to, the whole colour wheel and all that kind of stuff. And then also about the atmospheres that are created by the different palettes. So that's kind of what we're going to do in this one. And then in the next episode, I'm going to really home in on your own gardens and how you can use the sort of theory that I've pulled together in your own garden and how you can really make best use of it. And then in episode 4, 5, 6, and 7, I'm going to cover the plants that are the best for each of those palettes. So whether it's the first one, which is luminous, the second, which is velvet, the third, which is comforting, soft and warm, whatever, the fourth, that is washed, which is soft and cool, which are the plants that will really give you a garden that excels within that palette. So that's the plot and the plan for the next few. So anyway, let's just have a little think about how my colour theory interrelates with the colour wheel. And I suppose what I feel about the colour wheel is various things. One is that obviously because it's on paper, it's one-dimensional. And I have a real problem with that because plants never are. And you don't get the kind of warmth or the texture which when you're choosing a plant, is a flower particularly, is just so important to how it looks and feels. And so for me, my theory works better than the colour wheel. But also I think even more importantly than that, in a way, gardens are about feelings. And the garden that you want to create, you want it to fit with your taste and you want it to create a certain atmosphere. And there are some practicalities which I'll come on to, which is that some colours work better in certain situations than others. But really, more than anything, it's about the feeling that you want to get from your garden. And that is where colour plays the most pivotal role. And for me, the simple colour wheel with the primary, secondary and tertiary colours, that's luminous in a way. And then if you add the blacks or the whites, so you make it pastel or dark, helps a bit. And there are colour wheels that will do that, particularly the fashion industry use colour wheels like that. But even so, I just don't really find it very helpful. So that's why I want to explain my way of doing it. So what you want to really think about is about atmosphere and about the feeling. And so I've really tried to sort of distill down what each of these 4 palettes does, because it's very different. And so if we start with Luminous, which is my number 1 palette, which I also call boiled sweet or stained glass, I've referred to in all those ways in the past. And it's one of my real core palettes. It's unbelievably jolly. And I think of it like if you want somewhere uplifting, if you've got a sort of sunny yard and you want you walk out into it and sort of really feel like this is a real life enhancer in times of getting the blood pumping sort of thing. It really is that. And so it's jolly, it's cheery, and that's important. So I guess that's what's good about it, about Luminous. But there is a downside. And what I think about Luminous is that you need to use it quite carefully. And I'm going to come on to explain picking out individual colours or pairs of colours. I'm going to explain about that in some detail. But what I would say is, particularly with the Luminous palette, I would be quite careful not to stray into too many colours within the palette. And so I think 2, maximum 3 really work best. I tell you why, because it can get a bit manic, a bit busy, because you've got pink next to orange. And then if you've got blue as well, and purple and green and yellow, it's like, whoa, what's going on here? It's just sort of almost too much. Whereas if you went lots and lots of pinks and perhaps some splashes of orange, or lots and lots of blues, and then this is true in the colour wheel, the opposite side, and you go orange, that's great, but not to put in too much. So that's the sort of just the little word of warning with this palette. Be careful in one visual field to concentrate on 2, possibly 3 colours, not the whole palette in one go. And I think if you do, it sort of could be primary school classroom paintings on the wall. And that is wonderful and joyful, but perhaps not exactly what you want in a garden. And also kind of IKEA showroom, do you know what I mean? Where you've got sort of quite a lot of primary colours. And again, one might be wonderful in a house, but you don't want all of them. So that's the sort of overall feeling, I think, with Luminous. So do you like that or do you not? People are wary of it. I'll come back to how to use it. The second palette is Velvet. And this was where I started here in the garden at Perch Hill. It's the one that I'm still emotionally drawn to most. And I think it's because I'm a real sort of hot water bottle, comfort, cozy person. I love summer, but I love winter as long as I'm warm. And so these sort of warm colours, the crimsons, the carmines, the bronzes, the browns, the rich browns, all those really appeal to me emotionally. Somehow I'm drawn to them. And it is, I think, the palette that you want if you want a haven feeling garden, if I can put it like that. So really enclosed, lovely, comforting, velvety, like you might want to wrap yourself in it sort of palette. And certainly when I first made the Oast Garden here, I concentrated a lot on that palette for that reason. It was a sort of haven, moving from London, moving to the country, and I wanted this really lovely, sort of sumptuous, rich centre to the garden. So that is Velvet. And then the third palette is Comforting. And so again, not dissimilar. And this overlaps with Velvet because they're both quite earthy. They've both got quite a bit of brown in, but with the Comforting palette, there's also a lot of white. So the sort of browns become cafe au lait colour. The sort of yellows and oranges become apricot and peach because they move to the pastel range of colours. And what's that good for? Well, I really love that in our rose garden. And we actually are just about to introduce a whole new border based on this palette, which I'm going to talk you through in the next episode about how I put that together, because that's how you can really use these palettes in your own garden. I'm going to give you tips about how to do that. But yes, so for me, the atmosphere created by Comforting is as it sounds, really. And so words like cashmere, again, cozy, safe, quite sort of conservative with a small c in that it's quite easy to work with. You don't have to be confident with colour to be successful with it. And that takes me on to the final palette, which is Washed. which is the most commonly used palette by garden designers. And to be honest, that's because it's the most commonly asked for palette and family of colours by people who want their gardens designing, because it's really safe. And these are the sort of mauves, lilacs, creams, sort of pale primrose yellows, pale cool blues, sort of icy blues, and pure white, which of course people think is a wonderful colour in a garden, the tradition of which was set up by Vita Sackville West. And hers is the most famous white garden, really, and is a huge success. And what atmosphere do you get with that? I think it's clean and washed and crisp and calm and quite haveny again, but it is quite sort of classic. And I would say almost kind of somebody who likes wearing very ironed clothes and perhaps stiletto and high heels. So very much not me. I'm more the earthy end of that sort of range, which is why velvets and comforting are kind of more my heart palettes. Anyway, so as I'm describing that, I hope as you're listening, you're thinking, well, I'm that person or that person or that person or that person, or perhaps I'm two of those people. You know, I want my garden to give me two of those things. And I'll come on to how you can mix palettes successfully. But so, as I mentioned, when I first came here, the Oast Garden, which I mentioned in episode 1 about the book I wrote, The Bold and Brilliant Garden, about colour in that and the theme of texture. Anyway, so that was definitely originally velvet. And then, do you know what? I found I needed some brightness in it. And so I used luminous scattered through too. So it was definitely a haven, but it had some kind of, some highlights, some kind of cheery threads through it as well. And then in another area of the garden here where I'm very much drawn to the velvet palette is where we sit and eat, which is actually on the north side of the farmhouse. It's what we call our Dutch yard. And there, certainly in the summer months where we eat out a lot, we have huge amounts of really voluptuous, velvety things like petunia, tidal wave red velour, and a really wonderful climbers, sort of velvety climbers, and dark rich climbers and dahlias, like Molly Raven or some in the dark rich palette, the sort of velvety palette. So that's how I use it here. And then, as I mentioned already, the comforting palette we have in our rose garden, because it's sort of June, July, and it's where we sit. I have breakfast there a lot. It's sort of the lovely scents that often go with those sorts of roses. And it just seems to fit very well in that place. It's an east-facing garden, so the sun rises over it, which is why I have breakfast there. And yeah, so it fits there well. And then finally, the washed palette, we actually didn't have any of at all at Perch Hill until 6 or 7 years ago. And it's gradually crept in. And funnily enough now, we probably have more of this palette than almost any of the rest. And that's because it's so practically useful. So the first place we introduced it to was the farmhouse garden. And that's because it rolls out into the fields and the woods and the clouds and the sky. And of course, the comforting palette, which is pale blue, white clouds, pale primrose yellow, all the pale colours as well as silvers, the cooler colours. That is exactly what the countryside often looks like. So early in the morning with dew on the fields, it's exactly the colour that you'll get, a sort of lovely eau de Nil colour that we use quite a bit in the garden there. And also against the north-facing hedge, it's quite shady. And so we use all our whites there. So we have a phlox called David there, which does incredibly well and flowers for ages. So in the farmhouse garden, out to the fluffy clouds, out to the trees, out to the fields. It just feels a really natural progression. So what I would say to you in your own garden, if you have a big view, then I think probably the washed palette will suit you incredibly well. But there are 3 other places that we've ended up using it too. And the first I've already mentioned, which is in the shade. And of course, in shade, what do you want is you want to shine a torch into the shade. And that is what this palette does, the comforting palette, but particularly white. So all the way along the barn and the school building here, which is shady, we have whites and silvers and sort of soft greens, hellebores and things, along with white tulips. So it works incredibly well there. It also works incredibly well in spring with grass. And so for our spring bulbs that are growing up through grass, of course, you've got narcissus, you've got crocus, you've got scillas, you've got wood anemones. And then moving on in May to chamaesyas, we tend to really go for this palette, including primroses and cowslips, which actually are a sharper yellow, a more lemon yellow. But even so, against grass, against the green, we find this palette works really well. And so those are mainly, it's the palette that we use down the drive here and in the damson orchard. And I would say if you're thinking of planting up grass, maybe I would suggest that perhaps the oranges don't work quite so well. They're a bit shouty. And so, yeah, I think it's a good palette for there. And finally, we're making a dry drought garden here with Mediterranean plants. And actually, I'm going to stick to this palette there with very soft pinks, the cool pinks, soft ice blues, soft mauves, so purple mixed with white, silver. And that's why, do you know what? If you walk across the Mediterranean hillside in spring, those are the colours that you'll predominantly see. You know, cistus, rosemary, lavenders, all these things are in this same palette. So that gives you a kind of feeling, I guess, of, well, what I'm hoping to do anyway, is a feeling for which palette works in which situation in my experience. And I hope that there'll be stuff that you can sort of extrapolate from that for your own situation. And there's one thing that I know people will be thinking, it's just like, well, so have I just got to choose one palette and stick with it? No. Look at your visual fields. So if you're looking out of a window and you can't see far off to the right or far off to the left, and you're coming out your door, and again, you can't see the bit in the middle when you do that. So it's all about visual fields. So use one palette and one visual field so it doesn't become too busy and too manic. But you can use another one round the corner kind of thing. You know, it doesn't have to be totally strict. But I do think, I mean, here we have one palette in the Dutch yard, as I mentioned, and another in the Bold and Brilliant garden, the Oast garden. But I do, you know, there is a thread through, which is the velvet palette. And there's more emphasis of the Bold Sweet now in the Oast garden and more emphasis of the velvet in the Dutch yard. And then I do use bridge plants. And what I think of a bridge plant is something either that's actually a bicolour. So, for instance, it could be a tulip with two colours in it. And so one of the tulips that we use on the edge of the Dutch yard going into the rose garden is a tulip called Slauwer, because Slauwer has apricot on the outside of its petal and crimson in the middle. And that's exactly what happens going from the Dutch yard into the rose garden. Is in the Dutch yard, it's mainly the crimsons and the velvet colours, but you go down the steps and you get into what is mainly the comforting palette, so the apricots. And so Slauwer is one of those brilliant plants that we use a lot as a bridge. But also you'll find not just tulips, there are dahlias that work like that. And it becomes quite nifty in designing, is if you can find these bridge plants, they're really good, as literally as it sounds, like the bridge between one area and another. And we find wallflowers in spring are really useful for this, because things like Erysimum winter orchid has two colours in the flower. It has a sort of orangey colours and purple colours. And so you can use it in a pot even as the bridge. So you might have an orange tulip and a purple tulip and a Erysimum winter orchid in the middle. And it's that bridge. And so just being aware of those plants. The other one that I find incredibly useful are the Phlox Drummondii family, the annual phloxes, which we use a huge amount here. Phlox creme caramel has a really lovely cafe au lait as its main colour, but it goes through to sort of a really nice gentle lilac or mauve, and it has a bit of white in it. And so again, that is a brilliant bridge plant between the comforting palette and the wash palette. So do you see what I mean? You can really work it out by looking at the individual colours of the flowers and using them to bridge between one and another. But I just want to say again, referring back to the colour wheel, I would say use it, but at the back of your mind, because what gardening is about a feeling, and you don't get that atmosphere when you've just got a one-dimensional piece of colour on a bit of paper. And I find that rather than the colour wheel, using the actual flower, or I'm going to come on to other systems like using candles, coloured candles, to really help you pull together palettes. So the next thing that I just want to mention in this episode, before we move on to how to use this in practical terms, and I'm going to give you all the design tips and tricks that you can do in the next episode, but I just wanted to also highlight easy colours and tricky colours. And I suppose the reason I want to do this, easy colours are easy, tricky colours are tricky, and so people avoid them. And I really want to try and dissuade you from doing that, because tricky colours, yellow, orange and red, and I would add white, actually really, really add something to garden design. And so I just want to go through those just quickly, but individually. But let's talk about the easy colours first. So what are they? Well, as a kind of interior designer, you might call them universal colours. And as a garden designer, obviously green. So green in all its shades, from, sort of pine needle green or ivy green, which is a dark sort of saturated, quite black green, through to not quite euphorbia lime, because I think that's not a universal colour. I think it doesn't work with all. But, grass green would be the other one. So the greens are obviously pretty easy on the eye, quite calming, and to be honest, can work, I think, across the board in all those palettes. The other colour that I find really, really useful as a universal colour is silver. And I really have played around with this. And I think across all 4 palettes, it adds something. Even with the luminous, I've got globe artichoke plants here, which are almost evergreen. And I've tried putting them with an orange tulip. Great. So from luminous, I've tried putting them with a crimson tulip from Velvet. Great. I've tried putting them with a lovely soft apricot tulip, like apricot fox, for instance. Great. And I've tried putting them with a white tulip. Great. So I would say silver is a pretty universal colour. And my final universal colour that I use really widely for sort of gentle backdrops and backgrounds are the coppery bronzes. And if you think about leaves in, from November until March or April, whether it's oak leaves or even beech leaves, which are more coppery, or anything but, silver birch, you don't want, they're yellow, but the browner leaves, they're so great, aren't they? I always think that we kind of underestimate them and think of them as dead, but actually as a colour, they're so fantastic. And I actually use more and more browns in my planting plans. And whether it's brown tulips, which I've gone on a lot about, I did a whole episode on that last autumn. Dom Pedro is my absolute favourite. But I do find coppery bronzes really, really helpful with literally every one of those palettes. I find it's really lovely for bringing a bit of warmth to the washed. It's wonderful for bringing a bit of kind of sobriety to the what can be a little bit possibly sickly from the comforting. It's absolutely wonderful and fits perfectly and is part of Velvet. But it also is really brilliant with the luminous, because it just sort of, it brings it down, it calms it down. So those are the universal colours. And then just to finish up this episode on is about the tricky colours. So when garden designers take a brief from customers, even now, the commonest thing that they're asked to exclude are yellow, scarlet, orange. And I've been wary of yellow, so I feel justified in sort of talking about it. But I've actually found, inspired by a great friend of mine who's a really fantastic garden designer who has a yellow garden called Pip Morrison. And he has yellow mixed with crimson and purple, and it's absolutely beautiful. And he goes through all the tones, mainly the primrose, the soft yellows, but he does go through to richer yellows. But they're all calmed very, very, very carefully by crimson foliage, crimson flowers, and a little bit of purple, but that sort of smoky purple. It just works brilliantly. So I'm increasingly adding yellow into the garden here, even though I've avoided it for 32 years. I've never avoided orange. I'm crazy about orange. Orange is the highlight to the velvety colours. And so if you like dark, rich colours as I do, whether it's in your house, I wouldn't quite paint my walls black, but I like a good bit of sludge indoors, I do. But then having really wonderful orange paintings or carpets or one chair has always been a good thing for me, I think. And I do the same in the garden. So orange is just the most brilliant contrasting colour. Not too much of it, just a sprinkle, I would say. And scarlet, wow, tricky. It is tricky. But think of those alpine window boxes as you're either skiing, but they're probably not flowering then, or going on a wildflower trip as I do. And there are bright scarlet geraniums on the window boxes and the balconies tumbling down. And how fabulous does that look? And I do think scarlet is fantastic as a colour on its own. And so if I had an urban garden and I had window boxes or some pots on a path up to my doorstep, I would probably use scarlet, probably not every year, but I definitely would sometimes, because they're a real statement and they're a stylish statement. And so don't be wary of scarlet, but don't try mixing it with other colours. I would say that it's wonderful with the colour of stone. It's wonderful with the colour of, there's sort of more grey Cotswold stones or York stone. Looks fabulous, scarlet does. So on a doorstep, really, really, really wonderful. And, you notice it, don't you? It's like red cars famously get more speeding tickets when the policemen used to use the guns rather than, but when they had to notice the car going fast. And similarly, red marks in your essays when you're at school or university. So it jumps out at you. But that can be really helpful. I mean, that can be a wonderful thing. So a pot at the end of a dowdy path, fabulous, scarlet. And the final one, which people often say they want their garden to be full of, which is white. White is beautiful, but it has to be used really carefully. And what we find in the Oast garden here is if one white foxglove or 2 or 3 white honesties self-seed into the Oast garden, you walk in and it's on 2 layers. So you're at slightly higher. You're about a metre higher than the actual garden. So it's a sort of sunken courtyard garden. Your eye just goes straight to that white plant and you don't see all the rich, voluptuous colours to the right or left. I mean, you do as you walk into it, but it really is an attention seeker like scarlet white. I promise you it is. And so if you're going to use it with greens and silvers and the other more pastel colours. And then it will just sing and be the highlight. And it'll be like highlights in a good head of hair. It will be a fantastic addition. But on its own, too boring, I think, and mixed with really strongly contrasting colours. So like dark, rich crimsons and stuff, I would avoid because I think it's just too shouty. It's too contrasty. So quite a lot there, quite a lot to sort of think about and take on board. But I promise you, in the next episode, I'm going to really try and land this into the practical tips and tricks that you can superimpose these ideas of palettes onto your own garden. So I hope that was helpful. Thanks very much for listening to Grow, Cook, Eat, Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven. This week on my own, and next week I'm on my own too. And I'm carrying on with the mini-series on colour gardening. Next week, I'm going to concentrate on the atmospheres that these different palettes create. So I know it might sound like a lot of detail that I'm even on episode 3, and I haven't really got into sort of detail apart from the general feeling of the palettes, but that's because I think it's so important in a garden. And so where each palette is best used, and both practically and aesthetically, how to kind of put them into your own garden. So it's kind of tips and tricks, I guess, of how to use my theory in your garden easily. So I hope to see you then. You can find more information, photos and advice sheets on all the plants and recipes we talk about on this podcast by heading to the show notes or at sarahraven.com/podcast.